Welcome to LabMinutes.com. At this point, we have a fresh install of an ISE server, but instead of diving into detailed configuration, let's familiarize ourselves with the ISE web and command line interface. We will learn on how to navigate around the ISE interfaces, and along the way, we'll try to perform some basic configurations. We will not, however, go into detail of policies configuration or any testing in this video. So basically, we're just going to try to see where things are and set ourselves up for the future lab configuration. So with that said, let's get started. Now this lab setup is pretty straightforward. We have an ISE 1.1.2 server at the IP.102, as well as have a domain controller and a DNS server at .40 that we're going to be using in this lab. We also have a layer 3 switch that's doing routing to provide internet access. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is to look at the basic of the command line interface on ISE. So first we're going to SSH to the server. So the IP of our server is 172.16.32.102. And right here, you're prompted with the login. So go ahead and log in with the credential that you used during the setup wizard. Okay, now that we are in, let's do a show run. And let's scroll back up. So here, the look and feel of the command line is very similar to Cisco IOS, but very limited command availability. But for the basic command, like a domain name, you can see is their IP domain name, which we have set up as LabMinutes.com. Interface IPs. We have specified our name server, which is very important. That's pointing to our domain control / DNS server at .40. We have a default gateway, which is pointing to the layer 3 switch. We have a time zone set up to the US Pacific. And we need to make sure that we have a time synchronization, so we have an NTP server configuration here that's also pointing to the layer 3 switch. Okay, username, password, and the rest of these are just pretty much default. So these are pretty much all the configuration you need at this point to get your ISE server up and running. Okay, now that's basically the command line interface. Let's go back to our web interface. So after you have successfully logged in to the web, this is the first page that you will see, which is the dashboard. Okay, so basically dashboard provides you a very high-level overview of your current status of the system, as well as some of the summary of the activity that's going on to your system. As you can see here, there's not much going on since this is a fresh install, so we do not have a whole lot of activity going on right now, but as we progress through our labs, we will see more and more information showing up on this page. Okay, so that's basically under the home button. Next, if you look at the operations dropdown, here this is where you will, if you want to perform whether it's troubleshooting or look at the alarms or alerts or the current authentication, for example right here, that is happening in your network. This is the tab you'll be spending or looking into. So you get alarm, inbox, rules, and you can set up reports. For example, setting up like a favorite reports. We're just not going to get into go into detail at this point, but as we work through our lab, we will come back and revisit some of these options here. So the next tab or menu is the policy. This is where most of the configuration takes place, which is the part of ISE. Here the drop down is broken into different sets of policies that you can configure. Again, we're not going to go into details under each of these since it's going to be separate videos for them. But just to give you a quick overview, each of the, if you go into the policy, so the policy is made up of conditions and results. If you have been dealing with ACS5, the idea is very much the same. And You can also configure policy elements here for conditions that result, and just basically reuse those under each of the policies. Okay, now we move on to our last tab, which is administration, and we are going to a little bit more details under each of these options. Okay, first we're going to start off at system deployment. So the first thing you notice as soon as you click on that is a little information message that said you're currently running as a standalone mode. And if you want to do a distributed design, then you need to convert this node to basically a primary. So I say right here, to register other nodes, you must first edit the node and change it to the primary. And that's when you have separate nodes performing or having different roles. But here we're just going to stick to being a standalone mode. If you click under the ISE box, here we have host name, fully qualified domain name, the IP address, and right here this is where I specify the box is currently running as a standalone. You can easily make it a primary. And just because we are running a standalone mode, it basically contains all three different personas, is what they call it. So administration, monitoring, and policy service, without this box checked and grayed out, so it's not allow you to edit that. Okay, so for any node that is running as a policy service, you also have an option to configure profiling. It's very, although we're not really going to go into profiling in detail, you can see it's very simple to enable profiling. So we're just going to go through some of these and go ahead and check them. So for example, NetFlow, specify what interface you want to use for the particular service. So we're just going to leave everything as a default, since currently we're only using one interface, which is Gigabit Ethernet 0. So next is DSCP. I'm going to check that too. Again, we're going to explain these in a little bit more detail in the profiling video, but for now, just go ahead and check some of them. We're going to do HTTP, radius, let's see, DNS, SNMP query, and trap. Okay, let's go ahead and save. So the next tab is licensing. If you have a license that needs to be installed, usually it's if you were to upgrade to like an advanced license, for example, then, but right now we're just running an eval. But for you to install additional license, you would do it right here, and you can go ahead and add services, and then you will browse to your license files. Okay, pretty straightforward here. And on this page, it tells you how many endpoints that is available for configuration and how many is used already under the counter column. And since we're running the eval license, it's telling you the remaining days or days until the expiration. Okay, the next tab is certificates. If you have whether it's internal or external certificate servers, and you definitely would want your ISE server certificate sign, so it's basically properly trusted, at least enterprise-wide, if it's not publicly trusted certificate. So here, as part of our previous video, we already have a certificate created and signed by now root CA. So the certificate friendly name or name is called lm-is1.labminutes.com. You can see here it's been signed by our root CA, LM root CA. Okay, and it's currently being used as the HTTPS. That means it's the management web interface as well as the client authentication when it comes to use EAP. Okay, but if you want to create a signing request, a certificate, a CSR, this is where you would do it. Actually, it's going to be under local certificate. You click add, and then you will generate certificate signing request, and that request will show up under this tab right here with the CSR. Next, with the certificate stores, this is the place where you would store a trusted certificate. So at least right now we have a self-signed root certificate that we are telling the server to trust. A CEP, CA profile, that will come later when you deal with SCEP, which is normally during the BYOD onboarding process. And the ISE server will basically act as the SCEP proxy. So we're not going to set that up right now. Well, CSP, that's got to do with certificate revocation check. Again, we're just going to leave it as is. So locking, if you were to have an external locking server, start off, we have a basic storage period, and leave it default 7 days for now. But if you were to have a remote locking server, then you can go ahead and add it. Let's go ahead and do that right now for us. So let's just call it LM syslock, and the IP address, we're going to point that to our domain controller server, which is this RDP session I'm on right now. And you can just use something, well, for our testing purposes here, we use TFTP D64 that has the syslock server function built in. Okay, so we're going to submit. Okay, so the rest of the menus here has got to do with turning on and off different locking messages and where you want to lock them, or whether or not you want the lock messages to be sent. Okay. Now the next tab is maintenance. Under maintenance, we're dealing with data backup and restores, and we're going to have a separate video for that, as well as the patch management. So when Cisco comes out with a new patch for your software version and you want to apply it, this is where you would do it. So you go ahead and install, and then you will browse to the file of your patch. Okay. Next, we move on to the admin access. Here, this is where you would specify which identity source you want to use for your admin access. So by default, this is just the internal identity source, which is most of the time sufficient, unless you want to do, for example, point to your AD. If you want to get pretty granular as far as which admin has what kind of access on the server, then you will start looking into the authorization policy. So these are all the default policies that ISE comes with, and if it's meets your requirement, then you can just go ahead and use that. Otherwise, you can also come up with your own policy as well. So here, by default, we have a default admin users that we are currently using. And you also have admin groups that's based on policies tied to a different level of privileges of access to the ISE server. Okay, I'm just going to leave all those default for now. Access, you can restrict certain IPs or access to be coming from certain sets of IPs. By default, it's just allowing access from basically all the IPs. Session timeout, the default is 60 minutes. You might want to lower this based on your security policies. So if you leave your web sessions idle for basically this amount of time, you will get locked off automatically. Okay, next we move on to the settings. With client provisioning, by default, the provisioning is enabled, but however, the automatic download is disabled. And this is basically for all the different client that is, for example, the NAC agent or the provisioning profile that needs to be pushed out to the client. By default, the box contained none of those. So unless you want to manually upload them, then you want to go ahead and enable this. So we'll automatically download those clients from Cisco website, and you just basically set it and do not have to worry about it. And it'll basically keep checking it, and whenever they come out with a new version, the box will automatically be notified and download it for you. Okay, so go ahead and save that. Let's take a quick look at the monitoring. Again, this is just additional settings regarding the alerting. For example, email, sender emails, mail servers. If you have a mail server and you want an alert to be sent to you. Okay, you can specify a user list as far as who will be receiving the email, whether or not you want the email to be HTML format, and if you also want to send syslog messages. So let's check that and save. So posture, let's see what's under posture. This is related to posture assessment on the client. These are just a couple timers that's relevant to the posture check, such as remediation timer, transition delay, and whether or not you want to automatically close the lock-in windows after successful lock-in. So we can check that and just say after 5 seconds you want the window to be closed. Default posture status, if something becomes undetermined, what do you want to fall back to? So you can either do compliant, non-compliant. If you strict about your security, then you probably want to select non-compliant. So anything that doesn't work out as far as the posture assessment, it will fall back to non-compliant. And the user or the client can subsequently be denied access or be granted the limited access. Reassessments, again, parts of the posture assessment. After a while, the reassessment timer might expired, and you might want to force the user to go through reassessment or go through the posture assessment again. So this is where all the configuration take place. Just going to skip that for now. Updates. Here, this is where you get updates as far as when you perform a posture check, whether it's, for example, antivirus, Windows updates, or basically the ISE needs to be informed as far as the latest release out there. So you would definitely want to turn this on and have it automatically check for updates at the time of your choice. So right now, just let's say make it easy, we'll call it want to check every starting midnight for every 2 hours. So save. And again, if this is a fresh install the first time, you probably want to do a manual kickstart on the update. So right now I can see there's no update information whatsoever, so you can go ahead and force it by doing update now. Looks like as soon as you click save, it kicked off the update as well. So we're just going to let that running. Acceptable use policies. If you have a different acceptable use policies, then you can configure it right here. This is the message that you want to be prompted, or the client to be prompted as part of the lock-in and posture assessment process. Now we move on to profiling. By default, there's no COA or change of authorization, so you probably want, if you want to do profiling or any kind of authentication, then you have a choice of port bounds or reauth. For now, we're just going to pick port bounds. Okay, now under protocol, there's just little tweaks that you can do on the different EAP protocols that I support. For example, EFAS or EAP-TLS. For example, you can enable EAP-TLS session resume, so we can do this. And we're going to do the same thing for PEEP as well. Okay, proxy is when if you have an internal proxy server that you want ISE to go through before it goes to internet, then you will specify it right here, the IP and port. SMTP server, this is where you will set it, as well as system time. And just to reiterate, system time, having an accurate system time is very important when dealing with authentication on ISE. So you want to make sure your time is properly synced. And I support NTP authentication, so if you have NTP key, you can configure it accordingly. All right, so that's for the system menu. So next we're going to move on to identity management. And this is going to be related to identity database, whether it's local or external. So here you can configure or add local users if you like, and local endpoint. And if you were to choose Nmap for your Nmap scan for your profiling, then you can also see a scan result right here. So groups, next identity groups, also will be used as part of different authentication policies that you need to configure. And these are all local groups, and these are all the default groups that came with ISE that you have to assign to a user. You have to assign user to. Okay, we're not going to do anything with that right now. Just going to show you what it looks like. And also the endpoint identity also has the groups of its own. For example, if you look at the profile, there's some groups that's already there that's tied to the profiling. Right now it's got, by default, it's the Cisco IP phone and workstation, for example. Okay, next is the external identity sources. So these are basically identity sources that outside of ISE, whether it's an Active Directory, an LDAP server, or any kind of tokens, security tokens, and ISE also specifically support RSA Secure ID. So this is where you will configure them. You also have, you can also configure certificate authentication profile as well, and that will be used when you do certificate-based authentication such as EAP-TLS. Identity source sequence, so ISE allows you to use multiple identity source as part of the authentication. So for example, if you want to use your AD first and then fall back to local, then you can specify it right here, and then you would use that as part of your authentication policies. So let's take a quick look at one of these. So for example, guest portal sequence, it has nothing but internal user, so it's not so much of a sequence since it's only half one on the list. Next we'll go to settings, and these are the attributes that you can create, and it will show up when you create a local user. So for example, whether if you want email address, if you have a specific attributes you want the local user to contain, then you can add it right here, and there's different data type that you can do. User policy, password policy, it's basically mandate what kind of password complexities the user needs to deal with. So by default here we have a minimum length of 6 characters for a user password. You can see you cannot go any lower than that. And just a few checkbox to enforce additional password policies. For example, it should not contain the word Cisco, should not contain the word of your choice, should not contain repeating characters. Just going to go and check that, and we're going to make it simple as far as our lab. So we're going to kind of relax our security a bit here. So we're not going to enforce combination of lowercase, uppercase, numeric, or anything like that, just to keep it simple of our password choice later on the lab. But definitely do not. This is probably undesirable, or you probably don't want to do this in production. So password should not contain username, which is let's leave it right there. Password history, again, just going to make it easy for ourselves. Just going to do one version, lifetime, and this has got to do with password expiration. You can see disable user account after certain number of days if the password is not changed, and you can also remind user as well. So let's save. And that's pretty much for identity management menu. Next, we're going to move on to network resources. So I'm just trying to go a little bit fast here so you guys don't have to spend a whole lot of time, because we're going to come back and revisit most of this anyway in the future videos. So network devices, this is where you will add the network device where there's a switch wireless LAN controller or anything that needs to talk radius to ISE for authentication authorization. Then you add it right here. Network device group, you can group the network device into a different category. By default, it's just all device type, all location. But if you want to be more specific, you can create like a switch routers, for example, wireless LAN controller, or a location you can call a main building, headquarter, remote sites, for example. External radius server, if you were to have ISE kind of relay radius messages to a separate radius service that you use for authentication, you configure it right here. And radius server sequence is when you need to deal with multiple external radius servers, just put them in sequence. And ISE will try it one by one in order. SGA server is when you do security group tagging, which is a little bit advanced, and you need the right switch, both the software version and the kind of switch that needs to whether perform tagging or enforcing tagging. NAC manager, ISE also interface with the traditional Cisco NAC devices. Okay, so now we're going to move on to web portal management. This is mostly got to do with the web interface, whether it's a guest login or when you need to configure sponsoring. So right here, you configure sponsor group policy. So the concept that ISE has as far as for guest, and again, we're going to have a separate video talking about guest sponsoring and the guest login. So this is where you create or configured sponsorship for a guest, as far as who is able to sponsor and what kind of account they can grant to a particular guest for network access. Okay, follow the pretty much the same concept as being a user under certain groups, and by being defined by the policy what kind of privilege or access they can grant to guests. Here is a server sponsor groups, just a totally separate page from a regular user groups. Next we go to the settings. So this is pretty much the last menu that we're going to go through, or let's see. So start with general portal theme. You can customize your portal or guest portal as far as color. Just Cisco makes it easy for you to change the color. So these are very basic modification that you can do on the guest login page. For example, changing logo, background color, or fonts, or color of the fonts rather. Port. These are all the default ports that ISE use. Here is for guest login. So by default, it's port 8443. Unless you have a good reason of changing that, you should leave it at default. Now to access sponsor guest portal, also 8443. If you want to make it a little easier for people to log in to hit the sponsor portal, you can make a user-friendly name. For example, sponsor LabMinutes.com. And definitely you want to make sure these are also created on your DNS server. The same thing here with My Device Portal page. And My Device Portal, if you have not heard already, is basically for a user that is allowed to register the set of devices that they can use to access the network. Not necessarily has to be a corporate device. It could be the device that they bring in, or basically as part of the BYOD initiative. Then they can register the device by MAC address by visiting their own device, My Device Portal page. So here we're going to also do a user-friendly name called mydevices.labminutes.com. As soon as you do that, it says right here it's going to require a server reboot, so we do not want to do that at this point. But we're going to come back and do that later offline. So right now it's just going to say no, but keep that in mind. When you set this up, it's going to require a reboot. Purging when you have a stale guest accounts in your database. This is here how you can where you can set up how often you want to clean up your database. So you can say purge by default occurs every 15 days. And you can set out of days and so on and so forth. Okay, sponsor. And this is related to the guest sponsor page. You can specify what identity store sequence you want to use for authenticating a sponsor. And by default, it's pointing to a sequence called sponsor portal sequence. I would assume that's just the local right now. Just use local database. You can use set up the different language template for your sponsor portal page if you wish. Anything other than English. Next, for My Devices, the same thing. You can specify the identity source sequence for My Device Portal authentication, as well as setting up your language. Okay, on the My Device Portal configuration, here by default you enable the My Device Portal. If you want to enable AUP, or Acceptable Use Policy, you can check the box right here. And if you want to provide additional information for your internal user, for example, help desk email, phone number, you can enter it right here as well. Right here, let's do helpdesk@labminutes.com. And we're just going to leave phone number blank. Okay, let's save. Now for guest, and this is referring to guest login page or guest accounts. For guest detail policies, you can specify what guest information they need to fill in, and we'll go through that in the sponsor and guest video. Here we have the same thing, language that you can set, multiple portal. You can set up various portals or customize different portals to use for different occasions. You can see there's a lot of things that we can go into, but we're not going to do that right now. Okay, and here is the guest portal sequence. So basically which identity store sequence you want to use for guest login. And you got portal policies. The guest can be allowed to self-register. So you can say once they self-register what user group you want to assign to that. For example, you can just click guest. and what kind of time profile will be assigned to them. So as far as the duration of their account, that can be configured separately, and then just different parameters that you can set as well. So let's go ahead and save. Next, we have the password policies that you want to enforce on guests when they're set up their own accounts, whether or if the account is being created by a sponsor. So it's just the password complexity, but instead of internal user, this is particularly for guests. Time profile. Again, this is related to a guest account as far as the account duration, so you can come up with a different profile that has different account duration. And username policy, very similar to the password policy, and this is being enforced on a guest account also. Okay, so that is pretty much it as far as a quick flyby on the ISE interface. I know it's a little long. It's almost about 35 minutes right now into the video. So, but you can see here, pretty much once you've set up these settings that we just did, they're pretty much global, and you don't really have to go back and change it unless you really have to. And now we can, once we have all these set up, you can just concentrate on the policy configurations. So before we wrapped up, I just want to go back and show you under policies element. So if you remember, earlier in this video, we turned on automatic download for the client provisioning. So I just want to show you whether or not we have successfully. So right here, we have successfully downloaded, or the ISE has successfully downloaded or updated these clients from Cisco website. So before, I guess I should have shown you that this list right here would be empty. But now after you turn on the automatic download, it pre-populates the list for you with the latest version of each type of client. So that's why I definitely recommend turning on the automatic download. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up our video right there. Now that we have the basic config in place on ISE, we can pretty much, and we are ready to go ahead and move on to the next lab where we're going to actually start on the actual configuration. So thank you so much for watching LabMinutes.com, and I'll see you guys in the next ISE video.